Today we're talking about TYR and King Arthur. Now, why would we want to talk about that outside of the fact that maybe TYR has a King Arthur skin? Well, I think that normally comparing two gods is maybe not the best idea, and in many situations it's more misleading than anything. But in this particular case, things are a little bit different. And that's not only emphasized by their kids, but also by the fact that multiple people have asked me in my comment section if I can make a comparison between them, as there are a lot of similarities. Both are warriors, both are stand swapping, both have multiple dashes, both revolve around knock-up to some degree, and both have very similar base stats as well. They have the same base health, base mana, almost the same movement speed, and a lot of other things that just go very much in line between them. What I want to try and answer a little bit is, on one hand, just how close to each other they really are, if kind of both of them can't be in the meta at the same time, or if there are still enough differences to justify picking either of them outside of being way better at one of them. And also just how comparable their stats are, how fair they are distributed between those two gods. And I made a lot of interesting discoveries, if I may call it that. Originally I was planning to make this video a little bit later, after King Arthur's release, because I was expecting him to get some nerfs before he leaves PTS. We're nearly at the end of PTS. King Arthur is going to be released very soon, on Monday if everything goes as planned. So I'm not expecting that we will see any major nerfs anymore. Maybe some minor tweaks, some adjustments, but they probably won't release him with massive changes, because otherwise they'd have to possibly fix a lot of things. So we will probably have to deal with King Arthur as he is for a while, which may or may not be a bad thing. Spoiler alert, it probably is a bad thing. But either way, with King Arthur being released in this state, I figured I might as well do the comparison now. Now, we haven't established yet where King Arthur will primarily be played, but there's a good chance that he will be viable in solo, as well as jungle, as well as probably even support as a high aggression support. We'll see about that last part, because he has a few issues with that in regards to his early game, but other than that, I think he will be fitting in just fine in a lot of positions in his current state. And with that, let us jump into the direct comparison between King Arthur and TYR. Now, first, let's look at the mobility. TYR has a leap in his ultimate. This is one of the major advantages he has over King Arthur. King Arthur has no leaps at all, meaning King Arthur is blocked off a lot harder by walls, and that will definitely have an impact when you're specifically looking to counter him. TYR also gets CC immunity with this leap, which is not the case for most of King Arthur's mobility, with one exception. Outside of that, TYR also has 2 dashes. King Arthur has 3 or more dashes depending on your definition of a dash. He has a dash in his 2, which channels into a knock-up. He has a dash on his 3 with protection shred. He has another dash on his 3 that's a little more controlled and a little bit different in how it works, but it still is a dashing mechanic. And then you have the ultimate, and the ultimate can be like a short leap dash forward in either variation, so I guess it somewhat counts as a dash. In the more charged variation, it is much more of a dash. But those are a bit more conditional, so he doesn't always have access to 4 dashes, sometimes it is just 3, which is still plenty. Then TYR has self-heal. This is also a thing where Arthur doesn't really have anything to put against. He just doesn't have self-sustain in his kit himself, even though he can proc Gladiator Shield an insane amount of times with his different abilities, because he has access to 7 to 8 damaging abilities, so that kind of compensates for that to a relatively decent degree. But he has to build an item for that, so it doesn't count. TYR has a knock back and a knock up combo. It's also technically a grab, but we don't want to overcomplicate it here. That's the core mechanic here. King Arthur's CC in that regard is a little bit more simple. He simply just has a short knock up, which is still very nice because it still sets up his other abilities. Doesn't get the knockback though. Then TYR also has a disarm for 1.5 seconds. King Arthur, on the other hand, has a cripple for 1.25 seconds, so slightly shorter and slightly less useful in most situations, depending on who you're playing against. But then King Arthur also has a 1 second stun in the weaker form of his ultimate, or a much longer banish in the longer form of his ultimate. At least I think it's a banish. It's a bit of a weird mechanic, but it's not a knock up as such, so it's probably more of a banish or a unblockable knock up. So big win for King Arthur in terms of CC here. But then you also have the slows. Tyr has a 25% slow for 3 seconds on his ultimate in a relatively wide radius. King Arthur has a 2.5 second slow that goes from 20 to 40% depending on the rank of the ability in his 2. Doesn't even need to use the ult, gets that much easier, and it's still a pretty wide circle around him, so also nice to set up escapes, much nicer than Tyr's CC is to set up any escapes at all. Obviously there are situations where Tyr's ult with a slow can be more useful, but generally having a slow more often with a higher slow value seems to be the better situation most of the time, and 40% slows are something that, I don't know, don't really belong on a god with a lot of hot CC anyways in my opinion. Then Tyr has his unique passive that gives him crowd control reduction of every CC is no longer than 1 second. Very, very strong. King Arthur's is not quite as strong as up to 6% damage mitigation after you stacked up your passive on a target a little bit. That is actually more comparable to Tyr's third ability's passive, so a stance swap, which gives you up to 50 power and up to 50 protections, depending on your stance. So that factors in a little bit more in regards to damage mitigation versus protection. Overall, I would say Tyr has the upper hand here as well though. So when it comes to surviving a pure onslaught of damage, then I would say Tyr has the upper hand between his X protection, CC reduction, and his built-in self-heal. However, King Arthur, most of the time when there's not a wall, has a much better time getting away from enemies with all the different movement abilities he has. Then, there are a lot of things that King Arthur has, which Tyr doesn't really have anything to match that. He has percentage true damage from 14 to 22% in his ultimate. He has no mana cost on his ult whatsoever. For Tyr that's only true for the stance swap, but that is also true for King Arthur because he doesn't use an ability for the stance swap. Then King Arthur also has long range basic attacks, or almost mini leaps, and he has cleaving basic attacks, of which Tyr has neither. Tyr has slightly shorter cooldowns, but also less abilities, while King Arthur has longer cooldowns, but more abilities. King Arthur also has a ranged attack, and King Arthur also has 7% protection shred. Something that could be valued as an advantage for Tyr is that he has full control of his stances and when he wants to swap. However, King Arthur's stance swap is a lot more fluid because you automatically swap to another stance the moment you use an ability, and you don't have this clunkiness that sometimes happens with Tyr, where it's just the slightest bit of delay and it kind of messes up everything because your combo doesn't go off properly. Also, there's almost always an ability available for Arthur to stance swap if you just need to get to the other stance, and you can even do some damage on the way. So I wouldn't really count that as a win for Tyr based on that. Tyr and King Arthur have almost identical base stats, I already said this, only 5 movement speed less for King Arthur, but he also has his mini leaps, and I think even the base damage values are the same at the start. King Arthur also overall has a lot more AoE damage, especially with his 3. Last but not least, Tyr may have the slightly better early game. I haven't been able to test that in a 1v1 yet, but King Arthur's early doesn't feel quite that impactful until he has his abilities, whereas Tyr's level 1 with his 2 is very, very good already. I'm not quite sure if King Arthur will be able to compete here, especially with no self-sustain on level 1. And now we get to the craziest part, the numbers part. And I'm actually gonna give you a quick recording beforehand that I recorded right when I saw the numbers for the first time. Enjoy. So you're getting, right now, you're getting the live reaction of me to the numbers that I just looked at. Like, this is like recorded before the video when I was just going through the numbers and just calculating it in. And I'm gonna show you in a second, but this is absolutely insane. I understood that there was going to be a difference in damage output, of course, between them based on certain factors, but I had no idea it was this bad. So yeah, we'll jump into it now. Alright, back to the present. I normally wouldn't throw a reaction like this in here, but in this case, I felt it was warranted. I would say absurdity when it comes to the difference in stats is quite mind-boggling. So if we take Tyr's full kit, meaning his abilities in offensive and defensive stance, then we get to a total base damage of 1640, a total scaling of 400%, and total mana costs of 360. Those values are, I would say, towards the higher end, but you also have to keep in mind that most of those abilities will hit 1 or 2 targets at best, maybe with the exception of the ult or with very poorly positioned enemies. You also have to factor in that he gets a little bit more damage from the scaling, and that's the scaling only, through his passive when he is in the offensive stance, but that is relatively minor. We can keep it in mind here though. And then we have King Arthur. Let's first go through a scenario where we hit all abilities and then the ultimate in the lower charged form, which you will have up at that point, 100%. If you hit everything on a target, then you will end up with enough combo for the first stance ultimate or the first level ultimate all the time, for sure. So the damage here would be 2245 base. A little bit more than 600 extra. You would have 415% scaling, so 15% more. You would have 350 mana cost, 10 less. So you're already dealing more damage, have more scaling, less mana cost. You have to keep in mind that the 3 can be interrupted in one of the stances, so we can cut off a little bit of damage there, but that's also true for TYR, so I don't really want to weigh that in here too much. I'm also already excluding that you can double hit the 3 in the standard sense theoretically. It's not gonna happen very often, but theoretically possible if an enemy is running away from you. I'll talk about that more in a future video where I discuss more about King Arthur and his mechanics. And also, that's just the weakest combo. We could include the stronger ultimate instead. In that case, the damage would be 2565. with 460% scaling. Still 350 mana because the ult doesn't have mana cost. In this case, we would already be 925 damage apart. We would also have 60% more scaling. And that is still not the maximum. You have to keep in mind that King Arthur can stack combo meter very, very quickly. You usually have a little bit at the start already. And there are many situations where during a fight, you will be able to use both your charged ult as well as your normal ult. When this situation happens, then the total damage goes up to 2905 with 525% scaling and 350 mana cost. So you have almost double the base damage and 125% extra scaling. Again, this doesn't factor in the double hit of the 3 and it doesn't factor in the power passive for TYR, which increases the damage on the scaling a little bit. But it also doesn't factor in that King Arthur still gets up to 22% true damage with his ultimate. True health percentage damage. Just get that in your head. True health percentage damage. On top of all this damage that he already does. In conclusion, King Arthur has a massive damage advantage over TYR. It's strange. It's something where I'm really wondering why it is that much. I don't think he needs that much. It seems out of any proportion that I could find reasonable. At the same time, TYR obviously has its advantages, being a bit more defensive in situations, being a bit more sustainy, being a bit more disruptive to multiple enemies sometimes, and having a bit more setup. So I don't think King Arthur will entirely replace TYR once King Arthur gets a few adjustments that balance him a little bit. Right now, the only reason to play TYR over King Arthur is if you're really good at TYR, I would say. Because right now, there's just so much more damage out of King Arthur with an otherwise similar enough kit to offer what TYR offers to a team in most situations. And that's a bit strange to me. And that's it for this comparison. I hope this was interesting and insightful. If you're new to the channel, feel free to smash that subscribe button, it really helps me out. And other than that, if you want more info on King Arthur, I made a video on a specific item interaction, or multiple item interactions for him recently, and I will also be releasing a more mechanics-focused video on him very soon within the next days, so you have something to look forward to. I hope to see you all for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.